Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us here at Art Basel's Conversations. My name is Jenny Fulton, and I'm the executive editor for Art Basel, and I have the huge honour of introducing this panel, which is extremely timely. It's called The Ethics of Museum Funding. And only 2 days ago, Michael Rakovets asked MoMA PS1 to press pause on his video that is showing as one of their current shows, due to the interests of board members and their connections to private prisons and arms dealers. So this topic could not be more timely. And I'm very honoured to have us joining on stage Ms. Mary Ceruti, who is the Executive Director of the Walker Arts Centre in Minneapolis. Then to her, well, my left, yeah, your left as well, Sarah Douglas, who is the Editor-in-Chief of ARTnews in New York City. Then to the extreme right, Mr. Dennis Scholl, who is the president and CEO of Oolite Arts in Miami. And then Mr. Axel Rüger, who is the secretary and chief executive of the Royal Academy in London. The panel will be moderated by András Szántó, an author and cultural strategy consultant based in New York City. András, please take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's a beach day, so we really appreciate all of those who have come, and some many friends as well in the audience. You know, I've done this Art Basel conversation, 20 times, and usually museum directors are very happy to join this panel, but in this case, when we were preparing for this, I don't know how many we went through. Everybody had a calendar conflict all of a sudden. I'm sorry, I have a board. So anyway, applause to you for joining us for this somewhat sensitive subject today. And it is about a very urgent issue. And I want to welcome all of you and all current and future digital audience members as well. It really is a big thing to put these things together, so thank you for the Art Basel team for making it all happen. So, and we can roll those slides if you have it. I will explain what this is in a minute. So we thought that this would be a good conversation to have today, because I think that this year will be remembered as a kind of a turning point in the field of arts funding and museum funding. It's been coming for a long time, but this year was a bit of a watershed. All of a sudden, certain sources of funding, individuals, corporations, entire industries have come under heavy fire, heavy scrutiny from within and outside of the art world as being incompatible with museums. We have seen quite a bit of activism amplified on social media that has created a kind of moment of reckoning about where museums should go to raise money, what kind of individuals and entities they should be supported by. And what we've seen are really numerous instances where, in response to outside criticism, museums have been, should say, more or less forced to cancel grants, divest investments, and in some cases, sever ties with trustees. These have been very contentious, very painful episodes for these institutions. The art dealer Stefania Bartolami recently in an interview summed up the mood this way. She said, there's not enough good money in the world to sustain this art world. I'm Hungarian. We have a different saying for this. Our sayings tend to be very pungent. And in Hungarian, the way you say this is money has no smell. But unfortunately, it seems that now money does have a smell, at least sometimes, or at least from certain people. So the question in front of us is, who decides what is good money and bad, which money smells and which doesn't? How do museums balance their sort of insatiable need for resources, insatiable and growing need for resources, with their desire to be ethically okay? What does it even mean to be ethically okay? What rules govern what is okay and not okay? Arbitrated by whom, inside or outside the museum? So these are some of the easy, Thursday afternoon questions we're going to be grappling here in the midst of Art Basel. And we have an incredible team. Please give them a round of applause for, speaking in public.
I think I have a calendar conflict. I think I better...
Not too late. Yeah, it's
I
suddenly
didn't know those were the question.
your phone went off, right? Yes, urgently. So now, just to quickly say, these pictures behind me, where's Laszlo? Put your hand up. This is Laszlo Barabas, and this is the first time these are seen in public. And these are... Oh, it stopped. Could you make sure the pictures keep moving? Thank you. Maybe it's okay if it stopped for a second. So these are mappings of networks in the US museum sector. Laszlo's data science lab in Boston has taken the entire US museum ecosystem and has mapped, on the one hand, the web of trust-treed relationships. So in one of the images, if you can get it to work, you see trustees connecting dots. And in this particular picture, you see the flow of grant money to institutions. And the reason I wanted to share this with you today, although I'm not being very successful since it's not moving, is that it illustrates the incredible complexity of our ecology, a complexity that is not easily reduced to simple binary things. We live in a very, very complex universe. So maybe we'll get it working later on. It is working. Okay, good. And he'll be here later on if you'd like to meet him. For those of you who spend the last few months up in space or reading other kinds of news, here's a few of the controversies that we've seen. The Michael Rakovich story you just heard. You probably, almost everyone in this room knows that Warren Kanders, the trustee at the Whitney Museum, was forced out over his company's sale of tear gas. This followed the resignation or withdrawal of a number of artists from the Whitney Biennial. There's been a number of major stories around the Sackler funding of cultural institutions, both in the United States and on the continent. So there have been demonstrations at the Met, at the British Museum, Guggenheim, Serpentine, National Portrait Gallery, and the Tate have refused Sackler funding. Another example was at the Serpentine, where the deputy director resigned over criticism that her family invested in a company with links to spyware technology. There's been a whole raft of conflicts over oil money, which we'll hear about. The Victoria and Albert Museum, British Museum, National Portrait Gallery, all recipients of British Petroleum funding. Some have decided to stick with it, some have detached themselves. Then over at MoMA, you've had a whole series of stories. The Guerrilla Girls were demonstrating over links to Jeffrey Epstein. There was an open letter about Larry Fink, BlackRock's Larry Fink's connections to certain investments. Another trustee, Stephen Tannenbaum, was criticized, I think, over Puerto Rico debt. And all of this is part of a bigger story. It's happening outside of the art world as well. So, for example, 800 musicians boycotted the Amazon Music Festival because of connections to ICE. And as we'll touch on later, it's part of a bigger social moment of anxiety, criticism, debate around cultural institutions. So we'll get to all that in a minute, but the question for us today is not so much to rehash and revisit these episodes, but to talk about what happens now. How should institutions respond? What are the actual steps that they should be taking? We also have a member of the media here, which obviously this whole thing is being arbitrated in the court of public opinion through the media's participation. So thank you for standing in for all of it, sir. Very, very nice of you. And I'm going to first ask each of you to talk a little bit about how you've been grappling with the situation. I'm going to have a number of questions to go over, and then hopefully at the end some of you may have questions or comments. So, Mary, I'd like to start with you. You're not brand new, but you just started not that long ago at the Walker after an incredible stint at the Sculpture Center. You oversee the curatorial program and the organizational operations of the Walker. So tell us a little bit about the conversations you're having and how you're sort of confronting this kind of new situation, somewhat new situation?
Well, I think, I guess I would start by saying, you know, a couple of years ago, I wrote an op-ed for ARTnet about the ethics of museum of fundraising. And at the time, because if you think about it, this does come up sort of cyclically to some degree about people questioning different aspects of museum funding. So, but a couple of years ago, I was having a lot of conversations around, it had to do with sort of curatorial independence from the commercial sector. And as, you know, the lines between galleries and museums were getting more and more blurred, and people were accepting money from galleries and collectors, and, you know, how you kind of keep that independence in your program from whatever private or commercial interests might exist in it. You know, so I think that I started thinking a lot about this stuff then, and I think since arriving at the Walker, I've had a really engaged conversation actually with the board and our governance and nominating committee almost from the time I arrived around public trust. You know, we're living in a moment that where it's not just museums, but all kinds of institutions have that, you know, the public trust in our institutions has been eroded in government and education and religion, like in all of these areas. And I think, you know, we have to, I think museums have made a lot of progress in diversifying their program and opening up the way they're thinking about, you know, who's reflected and represented in their program and to some degree in their staffs. But now what we're being asked to do is to reflect that in our governance and management.
Right. So what do these conversations look like?
You know, we don't have the answers yet, but I feel fortunate that the board actually actively wants to have the conversation. You know, there's some of this is about, like, you know, crisis management. Let's be prepared. Where are we going to get, you know, like, what's going to come our way? What might our vulnerability be? But I think we've all agreed that no one knows anymore. Like, what might trigger someone to think that we're acting inappropriately? I mean, there are obvious things. Like, we know, we can you know, we can identify certain things that might be that we could argue are not in line with our values as an institution. But what it really means is that we have to go back to ground zero and re-articulate our values, make sure we know what they are, and then communicate well how those are going to manifest, not just in our program, but in our governance and management. So, you know, we're having conversations about, you know, our nomination process. Certainly diversifying the board is a super important thing that they've been, you know, that's a process that's ongoing, and I think, you know, was really, under my predecessor, was, you know, a focus of the board efforts. And progress has been made, but I would say the retention is as much the issue as identifying board candidates, and then, you know, trying to create a culture on the board that thinks about the role of the board as public stewards, not just, you know, obviously fundraising is a huge part of board membership, and we can't, I mean, there's no way we can survive without wealthy patrons supporting us on our board. That's, but I think the question of, like, how, if we can think of the role of the board in a broader way and recognize that there are multiple contributions that can happen so that we as an institution have a different role as a public citizen, you know, we're positioning ourselves differently. And I don't think it's a lot to ask for museums to do better, like, you know, at reflecting the communities we're serving. I don't think that's a huge ask, actually.
Right, and I think we'll try to circle back to is what specifically they can do to respond to that. But Axel, I want to go to you now. You're really the most. You really just started in London at the Royal Academy. It's been just a matter of weeks.
6 months.
6 months, but, you know, still, it's very, very fresh for you. And you came from the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, where you've done a complete repositioning of that institution, and it's a very different institution now than it was. You were curator of Dutch paintings at the National Gallery in London. And you're involved in many boards, and you speak all the time, and very engaged in a number of issues, both inside and outside the art world. And I know you had an experience with this issue very up close in your previous posting. So I'd like you to reflect on what you learned from that and how you're tackling this in London. And by the way, even though it's a European institution, you do rely on private funding.
Yeah, the Royal Academy gets no public funding at all, so it's all private. So we have very, very vibrant conversations around that topic. But to begin with the Van Gogh Museum, we used to have for many, many years, I guess about 15 years, Scholl as one of our main sponsors. Well, alarm bells all over. That went fairly quietly and fairly well for quite a long time. And then all of a sudden, one Friday evening, a group of people came into the museum. They had bought tickets, they came in, and then they were in our central hall, and on the stairs they all of a sudden disrobed and had white clothing underneath, and then they spilled something black from shells, haha, very funny, onto the floor and down their white robes, and it was molasses turned out later, but it was meant to look like oil. And what happened was, not so much the activity, but what happened was that instinctively, of course, our security staff got into a total panic and basically rounded them up. Once they had, their act was only about 90 seconds. They rounded them up, kind of gathered them in a corner, asked them to leave. Of course, the activists, they were from fossil-free culture, hashtag, they refused to leave. I would have done the same. So we called the police. They were arrested, taken to the police station. In the Netherlands, you're absolutely required to reveal your identity and carry an ID card, which they didn't, of course. They refused to give up their identity, so they were held in prison over the weekend. You could not ask for better sort of traction and social media publicity. I was inundated with emails, people asking me to release the prisoners and all of that. And it was way beyond my control. But what we learned from this, to cut a long story short, is that when it happened again, because it happened a few more times, we actually, threw the door wide open, we said, do come. I had to persuade my security staff, of course. Said, do come in, do your thing. You know, it's free speech. We are a platform. And when you're done, whenever you're ready, kindly leave the building. As long as you don't harm any works of art and no members of the public get in any way harmed, and of course staff. So, and what I learned from this, and what is really important, because Scholl then all of a sudden said, how dare you do this, and you have to defend us. And I said, no. It's not that the Van Gogh Museum has done anything wrong. These protesters are actually protesting against you and your practices. And we are merely used as a lightning rod or as a very effective platform for their protest. Because if they did that protest on the front steps of Scholl headquarters in The Hague, no one would take notice. When you do it at the Van Gogh Museum, front page news. So it has also, this whole movement has sort of moved us as institutions really as sort of the lightning rods and the platforms for these protests. At Tate Modern, the director told me, it's already at a level where she said, well, two of you on the same day, well, we can't have that. So you have to call each other, you know, one has to come on Thursday and the other one on Friday. We cannot handle both. So, you know, and that's also what I say to my funders. I said, if you, I mean, of course, we're talking about organizations or companies where I think we can take the money, but should it turn out that there are problems, you're on your own. I'm, as a recipient, not protecting you. I will, you know, allow for protests to happen, and you have to understand that in a relationship. I'm not here to defend Shell Corporation for their practices in Niger or wherever. You know, that's just not the museum's role. And that was a difficult conversation to have with them because they expected us to, you know, be sort of the first sort of protector of what they're doing. And so now at the Royal Academy, we recently had someone from Extinction Rebellion do a thing, and again we had that conversation internally with security and all of that. And furthermore, of course, it is a very, very thorny issue in terms of the internal discussion. For example, the Royal Academy gave up sponsorship from JTI, Japan Tobacco, which did a lot of pain because Japan Tobacco was basically bankrolling, the entire smaller exhibitions program. And all of a sudden, that funding was overnight gone. So, there are very, very active conversations, and also it gets into these gray areas, what is acceptable. For example, I give you one final example. It says in the policy, or at least in the discussion, we should not take money from corporations that produce armaments. Well, can you take money from Rolls-Royce? Actually, most people don't know this, but of course they produce engines for fighter jets next to the luxury cars and engines for commercial planes. So, and then is it a percentage of the production that they're doing that is sort of acceptable or not? Well, in our very, very moralistic times right now, even if it was 0.00001% and there was a trace of armaments, it would already be unacceptable. So, these are quite tricky conversations.
And the irony, of course, is that museums today really want to be the public square. So on the one hand, these are very challenging moments, but museums have spent the last 20, 30 years saying, we want to be the place where complicated issues are discussed in society. So these two impulses collide. I should point out that Rolls-Royce Motor Cars is separate now from Rolls-Royce, the producer of plane engines.
Yeah, try to explain that,
Yes.
when there's a media storm, going through,
Yes, I know.
over your head, so...
But speaking of the public square, the media, in a way, is no less caught a little off guard by this, I think, than the institutions, because a lot of these stories have unfolded in the public square, in the public space, through social media, not the traditional media being the arbiters of the story. I'm curious, therefore, for Sarah, who's the editor of ARTnews, which is, of course, a vital news source in the art world, and you've been a journalist for 20 years. You were at the Art newspaper, New York Observer. You've written for everyone. So you've been watching our space for a long time and reporting on it. How have you seen institutions respond to this, and how are you seeing the press, the mainstream press, respond to it?
Well, I think that the first thing I want to say, this isn't the only challenge that we as, let's say, the art press have come up against. I would say during my tenure at ARTnews, the first one was October 2017, the Me Too stuff. Because all of a sudden, the things that we're covering as art journalists have a much wider resonance and much more difficult legal issues involved. And I don't think this is a tangent, but I just want to say one thing about the field of art journalism. Okay, so it's separate and apart from how art is reported in newspapers. There is this thing, art journalism for art magazines, right? And it's actually relatively new. And I'm not talking about criticism. So you look at Our magazine, for instance. ARTnews started in 1902. Up until the early 1970s, it was basically a place for art criticism. It saw itself as a place for art criticism, okay? And what happened is, it's a little more complicated than this, so I'm going to oversimplify it. 1962, Art Forum was founded. And because of various things that were happening in the critical discourse, the theoretical discourse, Art Forum really took over that critical, we're the good housekeeping seal of approval, you're a real artist when you're in Art Forum, this sort of happened. And Milton Esterow, who was the previous owner of ARTnews, he and a group of investors bought it from the Newsweek group in 1972. And he said, you know what? ARTnews is not going to be primarily about criticism anymore. It's going to be the New York Times of art journalism. And that was a very specific remit. And it did very well for him because no one was really filling that role. The Art newspaper was founded in 1990. It's relatively recent. They also have that remit. They're not primarily a place for art criticism. They're a place for art journalism. Okay, so my point is this is relatively recent for us in the quasi-trade area to be really doing hard news, okay? So I'll say that. I'll also say when the Warren Candor stuff started at the Whitney, I had a meeting with my staff and I said, I don't want to talk about this all the time, but I want to know. I'd be interested to know, what do you guys think? And most of my staff is in their 20s and 30s, and they had very different positions, okay, where they stood politically, okay? And I said, I want you to be able to talk about this, and then we're going back to being objective, unless we publish an op-ed, and so forth, right? And I have worked hard to make sure that our coverage is objective, that it's not, we're on the side of the protesters or whatever. What I would say is, I object to us being perceived as being on the side of the protesters when we cover a protest that is newsworthy, right? That our job is to assess the newsworthiness of events. It's a newsworthy event, okay? In the same way that you can say art journalism isn't prepared for this stuff, you know who really isn't prepared for this stuff? The PR departments at museums, okay? Because we rely on them. They've never had to deal with this. It's not like they have crisis PR in there. I mean, you know how much crisis PR costs? It's really expensive, as you probably know. But so this is it's a whole network of things. So in a way, the journalism we do is dependent on the kind of access we can get. So if there's a problem with the PR department not knowing how to handle it, and certain things that the museums are doing, letters people are writing that are going out, we have to cover that. It's, some of that, it's a bad move, but we still have to cover it.
But have you made some staffing changes or procedural changes or created protocols for what to do under this very difficult situation, other than aligning with your staff about how they feel?
Well, I think all we can do is make sure things are properly vetted. Mm-hmm. We always have several editors involved in a story. We have to do fact-checking. We have to make sure there's no bias. Mm-hmm. I mean, what I emphasize with my staff is that we are not doing activist journalism. Mm-hmm. Now, you could argue, okay, you covered this and not this. Yeah. I mean, I could go into a whole other conversation about the resources that journalism has right now.
That's another panel.
I won't get started on that. But I think it's very difficult, and we are finding our way. We're finding our way.
Yeah. Well, I think we all are. And Dennis, you have worn every hat in this business and continue to wear most of them. But you've developed and built, first of all, your own collection. You've been instrumental in building a number of museum collections and getting other collectors on board to donate. You're on the board of 2 or 3 museums. You also happen to be a little bit a member of the press. I'm a documentary filmmaker. And very, very importantly, from Miami, you were the arts officer of the Knight Foundation, looking out over, $200 million of disbursement of grant monies to the sector. So, and you've been around for some time. So what do you make of this? I mean, it is quite new. And
my wife laughing.
And now you're running an organization here. Not one that has had protests, but how should museums respond? How should foundations respond specifically?
So the first thing you got to remember is disruption is hard, really hard. You heard here just in the last 15 minutes, Axel saying that he had a really great set of small programs funded at his institution by funding that was deemed to be unacceptable in some way, and he had to walk away from that. That is, you make your budget at the beginning of the year, you hope you know what's coming in, you hope you know what's going out. When that money disappears, your program transforms dramatically. Mary said, we will not survive without, wealthy patrons. So if we're going to begin to go down the road of deciding that there is, as Bartolome said, there's good money and there's bad money, and I believe that there is a continuum, and maybe over here is, horribly illegal acts that hurt people, and over here is jaywalking. How many people would allow a jaywalker on their board? Of course, okay? So if we're going to land on this continuum, and maybe we were too far out on the continuum for a while as a field, but if we're going to start to creep that situation over closer and closer and closer to somewhere else, we got to think really long and hard about what that's going to mean to our institutions, because our institutions are absolutely driven by this kind of private wealth. People do it for all sorts of reasons. I like to think most of us do it because it gives us great joy, and because we believe in giving back, and because we love this field. People do it for social reasons, personal reasons, whatever. So when you begin to take the source of money as a reason for working with somebody or not, and you're not just talking about the 1 or 2% over here where it's clear that probably not where you should be, that world that they're dealing with every day is going to change dramatically. The question I kind of have is, I think about the Whitney issue a lot, because I wonder if those artists, and 2 of the 7 or 8 artists that drove this are friends of mine, good friends. I wonder if they're going to have the Whitney Biennial on their resume. And then the next question I guess I begin to ask is if they feel strongly about this issue, are they going to begin to have their dealers vet the people that are acquiring their work? As much as institutions need funding, artists need funding too. So if we're going to begin to go down this slippery slope of this is okay, this isn't okay, or are we going to agree then that you can't have anybody on your board who's makes a product that isn't vegan? I'm a little worried about that. I like to eat meat and things like that. So I have a lot of fear about this right now, and the parallel that I would draw is what happened in print journalism, since my friend is here. And that is that print journalism was disrupted by technology, but at the end, over half the jobs in print journalism have been lost in the last 30 years. So if we're prepared to make a social statement, which is probably the biggest social statement we've begun to make since maybe the 60s, when we kind of all rose up against the war and other things. If we're going to make that big a social statement, somebody's ox is going to get gored. And I got to tell you that you have to be prepared for these institutions to kind of lose their way for a while before they find it again. And it's a big, big change.
Axel, I see you're rearing to say something.
Well, also we must be quite clear, because there are also, of course, there's a continuum, and then there are also quite clear divisions in terms of corporate funding and private funding, money that comes from the trustees, from private individuals. Because with corporate, you can still sort of negotiate with them, because there's usually clearer visibility what they're doing, what they're invested in. You can look at all sorts of reports about whether they have egregious behavior here, there, or wherever. Be it human rights, be it the environment, but when it comes to private individuals, you can find out a lot about them. And in fact, all our development departments, and we must not sort of be too difficult about it, do in-depth research around private individuals. Mind you, it's all publicly available information, and you would be surprised how far you can get. But of course, that becomes the conversation with a personal relationship. And private donors give on the basis of a much more personal, emotional engagement with the institution than any corporation. And that makes the conversation, on the one hand, more difficult. And also that private individuals can also more easily walk away and they say, you know what, that kind of scrutiny, I don't really need that in my life. So I'll take my money somewhere else, or I do something completely different with my money.
What a joy to know you have to go through a proctological exam to give to a museum. I can't wait for that.
I'm sure it's going to attract a lot of people to the role.
Yeah, you must be really psyched.
So I promised this audience that we'll get to some specific answers to how to solve this. And, we have 20 minutes to solve this problem. So We'll get there. So let's put a floor under everything you've said, and this has been all great, and I think it sets the scene very well. Mary, you said earlier, you know, as public institutions, we owe it to our public to, I think you said something like to have a higher standard or something to that effect. Let's begin here, because we're talking about ethics. Should museums conform to a higher standard than, let's say, other major players in our economic life? Yes or no?
Well, I guess I would correct and say I didn't say that we had to be held to a higher standard. I think we have to know what our own standards are.
Right.
And I think that's where, you know, as Dennis said, there's a continuum.
Right.
And we can make decisions about where on the continuum we want to be.
The question I'm asking
right?
is this. If I'm a corporation and Dennis wants to invest in me, wants to buy 20% of my company, or if I'm an individual and I want to go out and get $1 million loan from a major bank, there are all sorts of due diligence issues, and they're fairly well established. That's kind of the social norm. Would that be enough, or are museums supposed to aim higher than, let's say, okay, if you can bank in a major bank in the United States, that means you're sort of credible and legitimate. Is that enough for the museum sector, or should there be another level?
Actually, and I'll put something in here, which is that a collector recently said to me, medical research isn't going to turn down my money.
So again, is it the same as everywhere else or different? Because important questions come from that. Where do you stand?
Well, I guess we have to realize that this is for us a much different position, because the public scrutiny is also so much greater on us than it is, for example, on medical research. In a weird way, we are much more in the limelight, we're much more sort of out there. I would not want to say that we necessarily have to live up to a higher standard, but certainly it is a high standard, you know, that we have to live up to, and it has to become also the new normal, that you have a grown-up conversation with your donors about these aspects, because you don't really want your donors to be burnt either, because it's bad for both parties. Exactly. You know, the museum ends up with egg on its face, and the donor, of course, you know, also gets severely damaged. So you have to talk about it when there are issues where you have questions, to address them also, and not just, you know, sort of talk around the topic. If someone has a relationship with the Putin government, that is an issue that you better address, rather than clandestinely thinking, oh, well, this no one will notice.
So I think what I'm hearing is there is a slightly different set of rules. Yes?
Well, also different to whom, compared to whom, you know? I mean, universities are, you know, of course, hugely under pressure in that regard as well. We're really not the only ones.
Right. Dennis?
I think that Mary said something that I want to take one step further, which is you have to know who you are as an institution. But what's more important is that these institutions live in communities, and as internationally recognized as these two are, they still day to day live in their community. So if you have an institution that has a board, that has a staff, that has exhibitions, that has acquisitions, that don't reflect their community and don't reflect who they are, that's the first place you get in trouble. Because if you have an old school board, I would call it, you know, back in the day, where everybody looked very monochromatic, everybody did the same things, and you haven't responded to that, you're gonna find yourself much more likely in one of these situations, right, because of your bias that's already built in.
Right, so what you all seem to kind of agree about is that there are these other factors that, let's say, are different than, can Dennis invest in my company? And then the question becomes, who decides those norms? Who decides those rules? Where are those rules decided?
I would argue that the institution has to negotiate that. It's almost case by case. Like, I think you can't necessarily blanketly say, like, this is okay, or this sector of the economy we're not going to have anything to do with, and business when we are, and that's good money or bad money. Like, I don't think that's...
So
we're
the
in a position to do
institutions
that.
should
But
decide.
I think the way, I mean, unless you're going to radically restructure and have like publicly elected trustees of museums, which I would not advocate for. I mean, I think that organizations are groups of people who figure out like how, you know, who know their business best. We've gone, I would say probably that museums have been behind in making their institutions well enough integrated in their communities so that their governance and their fundraising and their staffing has the right networks in their communities. So the more, I mean, I think as a proactive position is to make sure that we do better at that.
Okay.
But I also would say, like, one of the, like, in trying to have these conversations with our governance and nominating committee about, like, well, who are we bringing on the board? We're trying to diversify the board, you know, not just racially and ethnically, but, you know, to other networks, thinking about who are our partners in the community. We do tons of programming with the Minneapolis Public Schools or with
Right. Well,
lots of community groups. So
But in the end,
how are they represented?
Right. So what you're saying that diversity on the board leads to a closer alignment with the community and helps you understand those standards better. But in the end, is it the board's
Yeah,
responsibility?
the buck always stops with the board. The
Yeah,
buck
it
stops
is
with
the
the
board.
So okay, and if that's the case, are current standards of board governance in museums in need to be rethought in some ways? Are there some committees that we're not used to having yet? Is there some piece of this that hasn't been invented yet in terms of board work?
Well, I mean, I actually differ a little bit from the previous two speakers because I'm not necessarily sure that a more diverse board gets you out of the pickle whether you take money from a specific corporation or from a private individual. Because while they may, on the one hand, have a lot of understanding of the issues, also it comes down to the crunch, you know, whether you take the money. And it seems to me also that we just need to, and that, therefore, of course, you have to have antennae and you have to have a really good understanding of what's going on in the public debate. For example, it is for all of us now taken as read that we do not take tobacco money anymore. But most of us, I would argue, very readily still take money from alcohol. No questions asked. Well, I foresee a time, and when I look around in my friend circle, where more and more saying, oh, well, I've kind of stopped drinking, I feel so much better. That in 10 years' time, it may very well be that alcohol will become as socially unacceptable as smoking is now, and we may not be able to accept money from, beer companies or whoever either anymore.
What about the cannabis companies?
Huh?
Yeah, we'll take the cannabis money then. It'll be all right.
Turned down.
Well, so
Okay.
I'm just saying it is, of course,
okay,
a
newsflash.
sliding
There's
scale.
hope for museums. Okay.
Be a
Sources of
cannabis.
funding.
Yeah, okay.
But I
And
wanna-
because the trouble is, there is, with all of the sus that is being cut away, there's nothing else emerging from the market that would step into the breach. Of course, that is, the sort of big elephant in the room, that while you can criticize and, take everyone away, we are all struggling to find then the alternative. Because is there any other wealth that comes from other sources that are then more, acceptable and correct? That is very much
But
the question so far.
I mean, one thing that's been so interesting to watch in this phenomenon is the role of artists, right? So I think a lot of this started with the Sackler stuff, and people read that long article in the New Yorker, and they said, oh, look, Sackler's putting their name on the wall of the Met, and then, in your mind, you're like, Sacklers are good, and yet Sacklers are bad. Like they're art washing the name, right? But to me, a parallel phenomenon that you're looking at is what's the most exciting thing in art right now? And it's been the case for the past 20 years, contemporary art, okay? Because it's not the old stuff. So you're looking at a huge growth in the contemporary art market, the living artists, right? That's what everyone's interested in. And once you're not, when they're dead, when it's old masters, you're dealing with objects. Well, guess what? Contemporary art, you're dealing with people. And that's been the most interesting thing to watch happen, because contemporary art institutions, suddenly, these artists are standing up and saying, you know, oh, actually, yeah, I'm going to pull my work from that. And you know what part of it is? Then you have to factor in social media, because they're going to get suddenly a lot more popular for having done that. And I'm not saying it's a cynical decision, because I don't think it is. But don't forget that the candors thing, when those artists pulled out, and I have to say, there's part of me that's a little bit like proud of this, not on the level of I have any horse in the race, but it was actually a piece of writing. It was an essay that appeared on artforum.com. And these artists read that, and it was about the effects of tear gas on the human body. And they read it, and they said, that's it, pulling my stuff out, you know? And that is exciting to me, because I like it when writing affects people.
Dennis?
But how convenient that they did it after the opening party.
Well, right, okay, but that piece of writing wasn't out yet. You're saying that you're not allowed to read something.
But there was another
and be
artist that pulled out beforehand that they all knew about, who I respect
That's right,
very
and that
greatly
was
for making that
Rakowitz.
decision,
That was Rakowitz. Yeah.
Okay, well, they knew that happened,
That's right.
and suddenly they had the epiphany right after the opening party. I struggle with that greatly.
Axel.
Well, I guess I can speak to that with some degree of authority, because the Royal Academy is actually an artists' association, and my board largely consists of artists. And they are just as conflicted about it. Of course, you know, they want to be on the right side of history. Some of them are more activist than others. But for example, we just had a big exhibition of Anthony Gormley's, and he was talking to our students, and the one question that came up immediately to him from the students was, Anthony, how sustainable, environmentally sustainable is your practice? Because, you know, when you look at his work, and you can, you know, and artists are struggling with that as well, and the whole sort of circus around it, and traveling everything around the world. So there's no easy answer from that end either. You know, of course, some pull their work. You also have staff in our organizations that are very activist, you know, and will also
You saw that with the Whitney.
sort of boycott their own institutions. You saw it at the Whitney, the Tate have, Liberate Tate, there are sort of, you know, various others. And the trouble is for our institution, and that I think is also the sort of conundrum that we find ourselves in, let's be really honest about it, instinctively, our institutions, of course, are liberal, left-leaning, you know, kind of constituencies. But, you know, you're dealing day in and day out with also the opposite end of the political spectrum. And, you know, how do you reconcile that? Is, you know, it's a journey. That's all I'm saying, really. You know, it is a sliding scale, and, you know, we're feeling at the moment our way through this.
Yes, by speaking from opposite ends of the scale, I think it's not, you know, Dennis, you pointed out that we're having a moment of political intensity like we haven't seen since the 60s. And I think overall, many would agree that that's a good thing. I think the piece that is difficult for institutions is how binary the debates have been. Yeah. It's the lack of complexity where we started earlier. We have a very complex sector, but the response is criticality in the form of cancel culture. Let's take the picture off the wall, let's fire the trustee, let's reject the funding. How did we get here? If you have 3 more hours, we'll solve this.
Well, it is true. I mean, it is what we've just, and I think there is a lot, in a way, social media has a lot to answer for, in a sense that a lot more stuff gets traction, and a lot more people also, let's put it this way, social media is not necessarily the platform for nuanced exchange of opinions. That's one thing. But I think it's also more generally a hardening of the public debate, very much also led, I blame squarely also our top leaders, our politicians for this. When I just look at Britain, I don't even want to go into the US case, but just talk about Britain. What politicians nowadays get away with saying in public about other people, their opponents, interest groups, and so forth. The hardness of the tone and the things for which 5 years ago they would still have lost their office, and now it's enough to say, I guess I'm sorry, and then, you know, it was a misunderstanding, didn't quite mean it like that. And that is giving license to so much more vitriol, to so much more. We see it also in public services every day, how our front of house staff gets abused by the public in ways that, because there's a different sense of entitlement now and so forth. All of that is contributing to this, very, very hard and binary debate.
But you're talking. I think there's two things. We can certainly talk about the death of civility, which is I think what you're getting at. But there's also this situation, and I've thought a lot about this. Okay, so we want to talk about the U.S. Let's talk about the U.S.
No, don't have to.
So if you're a person, I'm going to phrase this so that it's not politically aligned in any way. Let's say you're a person who's frustrated with President Trump, okay, and you feel that there's nothing you can do about that situation. But that is so bad to you because you think it's bad. And so then you think, well, what can I control? Because what can I, within what I can control, what can I make better? And I think this is something that is happening, this is writ large. And I think that kind of psychology is what's making a lot of this happen, is that people look at the larger situation and it's so bad and so overwhelming that they think, well, okay, at least maybe we can make these art institutions better. We can control maybe out to right here, and that's, and then I think institutions like the Walker is right. It started as a contemporary art institution. So to a certain extent, right, the artists are your stakeholders, right, and one of them, right. So then, I mean, you can't imagine you're not going to have Cameron Rowland in an exhibition that's supported by anyone who's involved in the prison industry, right? So,
well, if we can figure out whether somebody is invested in the prison industry, which we probably can't.
So then you get to the whole question of to what extent is the avant-garde wrapped up in political movements? Like how do you separate leftist political movements from the very nature of the avant-garde?
So here we
Do you know
are.
what I'm saying?
I think
So,
that's I think why museums are the target, is that they are providing a platform for
artists who are making
social
political
justice
statements
positions
through their art.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the moment where I've gotten a very hard signal that we have to wrap it up. Give me 2 minutes. Because this is what happens in our sector. We start talking about real nuts and bolts stuff, and here we are in the history of the avant-garde, right? But we did promise questions, but what I'd like to suggest is we are going to go out there, and we'd be happy to talk to you guys. But I want to close the discussion with a simple, practical question. And we'll start with Dennis and we'll work our way this way. You all have peers in the museum world. They're all going to go to work tomorrow, and on Wednesday evening, a bomb might go off, social media blows up, and suddenly they're dealing with a crisis like they've never seen before. How can they prepare? What are some practical steps that they can take in their governance, creating new institutions, new mechanisms? What would you advise for the sector to do to be better prepared next time for these kinds of problems, starting with you?
I'm very optimistic about getting through this crisis, particularly after today. Journalism continues to operate at really the highest standards when it comes to the art world. You heard two museum directors, Axel slicing and dicing it exactly how he needs to survive and to look for what's okay and what's not okay. Mary is talking about the idea that she knows that the institution must know thyself, and that's a very important thing. But for me, this will always, always, always come back to the idea of having the institution look like the community. If you have institutions, as Rocco Landesman, my good friend and the former head of the NEA, used to say, Temple on the Hill is no more. And that's how these institutions were treated for years. The people that ran them were a certain type of folk. The people that went there were a certain type of folk. It's not that it doesn't, it cannot happen anymore.
All right. So the solution is making the institution more reflective of the community. Mary?
I think that's what I've been saying all along as well. I think that is in very specific ways. I think it is as I said, I think this has to be negotiated case by case, and you have to. I think we have to have conversations about where we want to be, so that I mean, we can't be blindsided, right?
Right.
I mean, that, like, as you said, you know, crisis PR is expensive, but, you know, we do have, you know, we're developing talking points for, like, what we think maybe is what somebody's going, you know, like, where are we vulnerable? What are the things that somebody might think are not okay about how we're operating?
Sarah, what are some practical steps? Quickly.
I mean, what I would say is don't be controlled by what's happening on social media. There's still room for nuance. Don't think you have to put out a statement immediately because things are exploding on Twitter. Take a moment and deal with the nuances, because in the long run, like the story, you can still shape the story. And what's happening is people are looking on Twitter and going, oh no, there's a shitstorm on Twitter, like I have to say something right now. That's a problem. I would say stop and think, don't look at Twitter, or don't be controlled by it.
Exhale. Axel.
Well, that speaks, of course, to the notion that you know what crisis communication really is. Well, I think it would be, first of all, have a really grown-up conversation also with your donors. Take them on the journey, what you are going through, that they also understand, you know, what the responsibilities are and where the problems might lie. Indeed, prepare your organization, also have internally grown-up conversations in a very practical way with your security staff, with your front of house staff, with your press team and so forth, because we live in this time, and you just have to have your sort of, you know, as I said, your antennae out there, so that you are, of course, you can always be blindsided, and also something that you do that is really well-meaning can be hijacked by a group that you're seeing coming out of nowhere all of a sudden, and you find yourself embroiled in some storm on the internet. That can always happen, but just the awareness that this can actually happen and having the right people to deal with it is also really important. But I really do believe that we need to evolve the conversation also with our funders, with our donors, however diverse they hopefully will be, you know, in that way.
Well, I often find myself saying on these panels that museums are confronting more change over the next 10 years than in the last 100 years. I think this conversation was good proof of that. I think we've heard clearly that behavior modification is needed inside and outside these institutions, that they need to reset their relationship to their communities. They need to rethink how they operate and make decisions, and they need to learn how to communicate really well in this new environment. But one thing is for sure, the road to those solutions is through dialogue and very smart exchange among very smart people. So thank you very much for doing that, and for Art Basel for creating a stage for that. And with that, I'll let you go back to the show. Thank you very much.